All right, so welcome. Very excited to have everyone here, lots of familiar faces in the audience. Thank you for taking time to be here. My name is Reneé Reilly, and I lead the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. We are a nonprofit that is advancing the science around offshore wind development impacts and their potential effects on fish and fisheries. So, unfortunately, I think, this amazing growth in this particular workshop has meant that we are at the same time presenting right next door to the Regional Wildlife Science Collaborative on Offshore Wind, RWSC. And so you're on the fisheries side, and I hope everyone will be excited to hear a little bit more about this particular topic. But the title is a little misleading. It's the Offshore Wind Fisheries Monitoring Plan Development, Implementation, and Evolution Discussion Session. Our shift in this whole workshop schedule has meant we had this whole session reduced to just 45 minutes. So we are going to do our best to share with you some of the outcomes from the listening sessions that ROSA has hosted, but also to take some time to talk to our amazing panelists about their perspectives on the outcomes from those listening sessions. And at the end, we'll share a little bit about what ROSA is doing to effectualize those changes and those outcomes. So come on in, everyone. I just wanted to start on time because we literally have it down to the second for this session. So I'm here to welcome everyone and also to just give a little bit of background. I'm going to just take 1 minute to tell you about ROSA, the Responsible Offshore Science Alliance. We just finished our strategic planning process. And out of that process, we've identified 3 key objectives that we're going to be focusing on for the next few years. So the reason this is important is that the session itself is helping advance these objectives. The first is to administer regional offshore wind fisheries research. Both RWSC and ROSA are going to be administering regional funding through the support of developers in the New York Bight, and we're very excited that that's going to be launching in the next couple of months. The second key objective is to facilitate assessment of both regional and cumulative impacts. I think this is a huge question. It was the theme of one of the earlier State of the Science workshops, and it's also really important to note that we can only do that through things like data standardization and through all the amazing work that is happening throughout the community. And then finally, to build coordination through engagement. So today is a really great example of that, hosting sessions where we can really get the folks around the table who are doing the work, planning the work, and actually getting at these more larger scale analyses so that we can work through these really challenging questions. And so, as I mentioned, this is a tight timeline. That's all I have to say to you today. So I am going to invite our research director, Mike Pohl, up to share a little more specifics about the listening sessions that I mentioned earlier. So, Mike, come on up.
Yeah. Thank you, Reneé. So many of you will be familiar with ROSA's Offshore Wind Project Monitoring Framework and Guidelines, and that document was, let me say, I've been at ROSA for 3 years, and it came out just before I joined ROSA, and that's like the old days in terms of offshore wind. So we had a very strong interest in updating that guidance and to getting a sense of how people were using it, were they using it, and how it needed to be improved. There were some sections that were to be developed in the original framework, and so we're working on developing those sections. But we wanted input on the challenges in using the framework, and we wanted to identify areas for improvement. So we held listening sessions with individual sectors. We met individually with developers, with fishermen, with regulators, and with scientists, and to have a conversation about their use of these of our guidelines. These sessions were meant to be, one of the reasons we met as individual sectors was to give people the freedom to sort of speak their minds and to, we did not attribute comments to anyone, so people were free to sort of give us good feedback on the guidelines. We started doing that in December 2023 and finished up in February 24. We had really good participation, which we appreciate very much, over 120 people, and then at our quarterly advisory council meeting on the 14th of July, we divided up into breakout groups, cross-sectoral breakout groups, to discuss some of the outcomes from those listening sessions and to make conclusions about them. So this is a kind of a ridiculously brief slide of all the different outcomes that came from meeting four sectors together. We heard that the guidelines are widely used, and we heard they should be a lot more prescriptive and specific, and they should also be more flexible and less prescriptive. We were encouraged to coordinate, that the guidelines should encourage coordination and standardization across fishery monitoring plans from different lease areas, and that this question of baseline, and we just heard that terrific plenary talk, what is the baseline? A lot of challenges in establishing what the baseline is to measure impacts from offshore wind that include climate, permitting challenges, even understanding the landscape of what states require, what the feds require for monitoring and pre-construction, and identifying appropriate control areas. And there was a general sense that there were insufficient requirements for assessing impacts to fishing. And also, there was we were asked to promote and advocate for an important role for fishing industry representatives in the updated guidelines, in our plan for updating the guidelines. When we had the breakout sessions, this is what we heard at our advisory council meeting last month. Again, so some of these things are a little repetitive. We want flexibility in the monitoring guidelines, but try to imagine someone trying to write a fishery monitoring plan from scratch. Are the guidelines adequate enough to lead them through that process? Focus on the research questions that need answering. There's so many things that could be addressed in a fishery monitoring plan, but what are the questions that really need answering? And the guidelines can't cover everything. And again, the question of baseline and how to design monitoring around think of the baseline that you want to establish and how to design monitoring around that, regardless of time period. And then again, a better understanding of the pre-construction requirements, consideration of climate change, and it was also noted that there were opportunities to uplift what's available in terms of trying to consider climate change in fishery monitoring plans, and then consider a tiered approach for deciding what to monitor. So what we've asked, and as Reneé highlighted, we've had to compress this session down. We've given our panelists 5 minutes, essentially. We did give them a lot more material than I've just presented to you, and asked them this question. But so I'll introduce the panel very quickly. We have Deidre Bulkey, who's from, oh great, this is good news for later in this presentation. Fisheries manager at RWE Offshore Wind Services. Everyone pretty much knows Morgan from, who's the Offshore Wind Marine Fisheries Project Manager at NYSERDA. Brian Hooker, the Biology Section Chief at the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and Dave Secor, who's a professor at the University of Maine Center for Environmental Science. So they've looked at a fuller list of the outcomes that I showed you and asked them which of the outcomes is most important from your perspective, and how and by whom it can or ought to be addressed. And since Deidre's closest to me, why don't you go first?
Thanks. How's that? Okay. Thank you, Mike, and thanks for putting this panel together. Very briefly, I'm Deirdre Bulkey, as Mike said, Fisheries Manager with RWE. Really briefly, a little background. RWE is a global energy company, and it's been around for 125 years. They operate 19 offshore wind projects globally, and here in the U.S. really has started over the last 2 years and has now acquired 3 lease areas, one in the New York Bight, one in Northern California, and one in the Gulf of Mexico. So there was a lot of material that you went through with all of those sessions. I did get to participate. It was really valuable. From everything that was shared, I would maybe touch on 2 in particular and try to give you a sense from a developer's perspective. This is a huge task, putting together these monitoring plans. They're very comprehensive, they're very complex, and they're really important. And I would say from our perspective, as came up a few times from the different groups, guidance is essential, it's critical. There is some guidance out there. But striking that balance, as was mentioned, between being too prescriptive as well as needing some flexibility is really where the key is in terms of getting that together. That's one thing I'll touch on briefly. And then also a really interesting outcome from one of the panels was a tiered approach, or trying to think about not solving every single question right out of the gate, but maybe building onto some of these monitoring programs so they're not, completely comprehensive on day one, but figuring out how to build things over time. So those are probably the two things I'd like to highlight. In terms of the who and the how, I think the who is probably pretty obvious, that everybody needs to be at the table. You can't just have one group working over here and one over here, so everyone really needs to be there. And then the how, just briefly to share two things that our team is trying to work on right now in terms of how the New York Bight developers in particular kind of saw this need and this interest of everyone wanting to do collaborative and cooperative monitoring across the region. And we had the benefit of seeing other projects before us and learning from them. And so, pretty early on after the lease, there was an idea to have the New York Bight developers meet more regularly. And so, over a year and a half or so, the developers within the New York Bight have been meeting every month. Monitoring is one of the major things that we talk about. We don't have, a very clear path of exactly what it'll look like, but it's helping to communicate and share what the major obstacles are, so that we then kind of collectively can speak to regulators, speak to the industry, kind of in one group, so we can all hear those things together. I think that's one way to do it. And then also it came up in a lot of the panels that Mike shared that NOAA really is an essential partner. A lot of the guidance is coming from NOAA. More reports are coming out each year, but really it was highlighted that more communication is needed with NOAA throughout the process, and our team would definitely agree with that. And we have tried to kind of have a more formalized agreement with NOAA and a working partnership. It's called a Cooperative Research and Development Agreement. It's definitely helping to formalize, again, just a regular cadence of talking through, understanding their expectations and needs, and in reverse, hopefully the developers sharing some of their limitations, so that we can, at the end, hopefully, get to a better place. So those would be quickly some examples. And then the second one, in terms of the tiered approach, definitely, as I mentioned, developing these programs is very complex, getting the permitting in order, getting all the logistics together. And so if there's a way through industry partners and ROSA to identify the key gaps, focus on those priorities first, and then identify ways to build in some of those other examples to come later, that's something that definitely could be fruitful and something that we'd like to talk more about and focus on. Hopefully that was under 5 minutes. Okay.
Yes. So I should point out, I know you're itching to ask questions. We're not anticipating there'll be any time for questions, but if I understand the meeting app, people can still ask questions in the app, I think, and the speakers can respond to them offline. Sorry for that, but that's where we are.
So I'll try and keep this brief because I know, Mike, you got a lot to cover, but But
we want to hear from you, Morgan.
Right. So I'm Morgan Brunbauer. I'm the Offshore Wind Marine Fisheries Manager at NYSERDA. For folks who don't know who NYSERDA is or our role in the process, we're non-regulatory. We hold the offshore wind contracts for New York State. I sit within our environmental research team, so we provide a lot of the science to help inform our regulators and our policymakers about what processes should go forward and provide a lot of that data and scientific need in a lot of these conversations. You'll probably hear very similar kind of themes throughout probably the four of us here. We've really come a long way, I think, since I've been started working on this in 2015, going from why questions to now how. And I think, it really is on all of us to work together to try and break down those walls of analysis paralysis or the risk of inaction, because ultimately that's going to hurt us all. And one of the bullets up there was kind of coordination and standardization. And I think that is a big piece that needs to continue to happen, and standardization, again, being non-regulatory, is really helpful for our fellow regulators in the room. You know, if there's a standardized approach that states can implement and talk to each other with, the greater the likelihood that those plans and the collection of data and science can be uniform across the region rather than a state-centric view. You know, I think we also have to think about fostering like a learning environment and allow for adaptive management and allow for some of these plans to acknowledge that we may not know what the future state may be. And if we need to answer the questions now, but we need to leave room for growth in the future to address those additional questions, which I think is the tiered approach. Another thing is we need to show efficacy in these plans. We need to make sure that they're enforceable, they're measurable, so if we are looking at change over time, we can identify that. Validated measures really help regulators be consistent. So if we have these plans and we're looking at strategies or approaches, the ones that are proven or tested can often be the ones that get adopted by states. That doesn't mean that you can't advocate for newer technologies, but I think we have to make sure that we're also validating those and that there needs to be a process for those. Again, use the best available knowledge and acknowledge that the future state may be unknown, but ultimately at the end of the day, we need effective collaboration and coordination that creates predictability and builds towards execution of these mitigation plans and these monitoring programs. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Morgan.
Oh, yeah.
What?
No, I was going to say.
Go ahead.
I think I covered it all. But.
Well, now you've got everyone wondering what was Morgan going to say.
I missed the how. I missed the how. But I think what it is really, ROSA sets up a really good platform for getting kind of the expertise into the room. And, you know, there's a lot of great brain power and a lot of great science, whether that's at academia or in the consulting world, the developer world, the state world, to really centralize it and come to agreement about how to move forward. And I think that could be smaller forums for tackling a particular survey method or a particular question and outlining how do we get the data we need to make or to answer questions that move the needle, right? We don't want to just collect science or collect data for the sake of doing that. We really need to understand what the objective is, but we have the brain power in the room to do that. We just have to take the time to do it properly.
Thank you. Thank you, Morgan. Brian, speaking of brain power.
Hi, Brian Hooker, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. I can just say ditto, right, Morgan? No, you touched on a lot of the same things that I was really going to touch on. I mean, we started this, BOEM did, when we first, commissioned the University of Rhode Island to come up with standard protocols for fisheries surveys. We then took those protocols and implemented them into, a fishery guidance document. And then, so that was getting us to the how. We kind of first identified almost like where the ROSA guidance is now, or spent some time with, is like, all right, this is how we want to do it, but then there's the what, right? And so, we've invested, on a few different occasions on different workshops at BOEM, and then there's other than ROSA and RWSC and others who have, and NYSERDA have done similar workshops to try to get at, okay, we know, I think potentially how, but what do we want to focus our efforts on? And that's one thing that I've really tried to encourage ROSA and RWSC to move us in that needle, and I think that was probably one of the highlights there from the feedback session, is like narrowing it down. Okay, we have like all these different ways of testable hypotheses and know how to ask the questions, but how can we build consensus on, okay, these are the questions that we really want to focus on? Because as Morgan says, we really want to collect the information in a way that does actually answer them in the long run, or even the short run, ideally. So anyway, I think I pushed ROSA on that to the point that they then invited me to be on the board. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but.
And you accepted. Not just invited, you accepted.
And I accepted. So that's something I hope to be able to continue to work with them on. The other, thing I really wanted to highlight is, getting to that data standardization. I think Deirdre already touched on this, but when we first were starting on a lot of these projects, it was very much the project-specific types of surveys that were being conducted, and the idea was, okay, we need to really standardize that, not necessarily just the data collection, but the data submittal, like the way that the information is being submitted so that we can try to compare and contrast, look at some of the results across projects. But now we're really seeing an evolution, like with the lessees and the New York Bight, that I think are like collaboratively designing the projects. So they're in it from the beginning and being collaborative. So I think that's been an encouraging outcome as well. So that I think that kind of answers the how and by whom. I think there's a lot of responsibility not only on the lessees, but state and federal agencies as well. I know that for a lot of the regional aspects, we have an environmental studies program, looking at Mike Rasser there, and we can help look at that regional perspective a little bit differently than maybe a lessee would if we're doing like something on the shelf break. We may not ask a lessee to go out and measure the hydrography of the shelf break, but maybe BOEM could, because we want to understand how that is impacting circulation patterns inshore and in the lease areas. So there's a role for multiple different groups to not only fund the studies, but then we have, as I mentioned, groups like ROSA and the RWSC to help build some consensus and build some collaboration around what those priorities should likely be. And that's what I'm going to continue to try to work toward, even though it is a very difficult process, and those who are involved with the initial guidance development knows that it was a heavy lift to even work through that process document. And as Mike mentioned in the slides, there's still some to be filled in sections there that we hope to continue to build on. So I'll just close there, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Brian. And just so the arrival of these folks at this door means that you'll be hearing from our interns about steps to develop, in just a few minutes, steps to develop those sections that haven't been developed yet. So thank you, Brian. Dave Secor?
Yeah, pleasure to meet you all. I'm a professor at University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science, and I guess a bit of an old-timer in that I was heavily engaged in drafting the ROSA guidance document, and then I turned around, and U.S. Wind developer entrusted me to design and implement a fishery resource monitoring plan, and we're in the midst of an 8-year backy, so I'm in the enviable position of having written my own guidance and having to follow it. And I would say suggest it's going pretty well, and I think it's this balance of having some stipulations and having some flexibility. The flexibility was particularly important in that I designed something I thought was just beautiful, bag of gradient design with pots and had all the bells and whistles, and then I got on the boat. And it was a big education for me, and I'm very grateful to Captain Harrington for showing me the realities. I would have sunk his boat with all the gear that I wanted to deploy. And fortunately, the developer also was a bit proactive, and they allowed us to have a trial year. So that is a big part of the adaptation, too, is you don't know what you're doing off the bat. And it's important to get out, have a year where you can see what works, and also where you can collect up variance estimates to see if you're sampling sufficiently to look at your hypothesized effect size, the power analysis, which was a big part of the guidance document. And the other thing that I learned getting on his boat is that this has to be more than just about mitigation. Mitigation is really front and center for us, certainly, but we also have to think about adaptation. That if we're going to be out with our stakeholder fishermen over the next 8 years, we're going to be learning with them as they adapt and learn how to fish around these structures. And I really would like to encourage us to think more broadly about this coexistent equation, which is not just mitigation, but it's also adaptation. The other point I wanted to make was one that mentioned by Greg in our plenary, was that he thought that we're growing in sync with offshore wind. I disagree, at least with the science workforce. I think we're really challenged, and there's an increasing gap in the young professionals that we can produce at universities or that we can in other educational programs, and what the industry, agencies, NGOs need. And that gap is very real, and it's growing exponentially. And we've heard about internship programs and fellowship programs, and I really think that this is a challenge and opportunity for us to gain a common science vision through fellowship programs. NOAA, we've heard about that they've had programs in terms of perceived lack of stock assessment scientists, of economists, of lesser represented demographics. And now we have not only NOAA, but BOEM and Department of Energy. It seems that this is a real opportunity for those agencies to recognize this need that's there and invest in the training that's going to require. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. So we're going to transition to, so we'd like to thank the panelists. Please thank the panelists. So as we've been holding the listening sessions, ROSA's been listening to what people have been saying and how to improve that guidance document. And so what you're about to hear is you're about to hear from 3 other folks from ROSA about steps that we're taking, are already taking, even before we've sort of gone through. Let me take a step back. So we've taken notes of these comments, and all the other comments we've heard in the listening sessions and in the breakout sessions, and there will be a report forthcoming on what we've heard. At the same time, in parallel, we're already moving forward with expanding and improving the guidance document. And you're going to hear about a few steps that ROSA is taking in response to what we've heard. And the first person we're going to hear from is Tricia, who's not a former ROSA intern, but speaking of Dave's comments about interns, is a former Knaus fellow. So Tricia, please. So please.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yes, so I'm going to talk about some next steps that we're making. And one I'm very excited to share today is the soft launch, we're calling it, of our Fish Forward database. And so how this relates to monitoring is within this Fish Forward database is all the fishery monitoring plans that are implemented, and I've broken them down by the different surveys. So it's not, I love everyone's phone going up. I love it. I'm so happy. But yeah, all the fisheries monitoring surveys are on there, so it's broken down by each trawl survey, each telemetry study. And as you can see, on there, you can filter by the methodology, by the receptor, by who's doing the work. So any researcher in here, if you're doing work, I would love for you to go to, if you go to the Database Center tab and look under Current Projects, that has all the information. And if your project is not there, please go to the Submit tab and let me know so that I can add it. And there's a spot for corrections too if something's not quite right. But yeah, I'm really excited about that, especially for the monitoring plans, because any developers that are starting to develop plans, there is a yes or no for developer monitoring plans, so you can just see a whole list of everything. And I think that should really help looking at objectives and what people are doing, working on. And we are also looking at data governance. So one of the questions in the Q&A I saw was, what's the difference between ROSA and RWSC, and how do we work together? So ROSA is on fish and fisheries, and RWSC is on wildlife, so mammals, turtles, birds and bats, habitat, protected fish species, so like sturgeon. But one big overlap is this issue of data, and a lot of times those methods are the same as well. And so they started a data subcommittee along with their taxon, so I attended that, and there were a lot of fisheries folks there. And so I brought that back to ROSA and said, I think we should make our own subcommittee. So we are working on developing that now, and we've got a partnership with Intertidal in the works, who's also working with RWSC, so there's going to be a lot of coordination there. And so we are recruiting members now as we really put together our terms of reference. So if you work with data, what are these, we have, if you are in data management, subject matter expertise in different data collections, so if you're dealing with your data for acoustic telemetry or bottom trawl, if you're doing these surveys, we'd love to have you on our team. So that's a form to it's just your name and who you are, and then we'll reach out soon. If you're reusing data, that's huge, right? Because we all want accessibility. Data licensing and sharing, we'll get into that. And so our goal is to kind of work on this data guidance to then get to that cumulative impacts. How can we start to use all the different data sources to look at these bigger questions? And so I think one way that makes sense to focus is by the methodologies. So looking at telemetry, looking at the bottom trawl data. So yeah, would love to see some of you sign up and join us this fall as we go down that. So that's all from me. And so I will allow Reneé.
Okay. And so we have obviously got a lot going on. These launches were really exciting for us to make at this particular platform because you all are the people who are going to help us do all of this work. And so we're just thrilled to be officially launching this committee, officially launching the Fish Forward tool, and also updating the guidance. So as Mike kind of foreshadowed, we're going to invite each of ROSA's summer interns up to tell you just a little bit, just a few minutes, about how they're approaching that guidance update. So Nusrat, if you want to come on up and give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everyone. Everyone can hear me? Right?
Yeah.
Yes, great. So my name is Nusrat Noor, and I am working on the benthic habitat monitoring guidelines for ROSA. I don't want to take too much time, so I'm going to go right into it. So my initial approach started off with kind of a surface level search with specific questions in mind, such as what are the current standards, if any, what practices are developers currently using or intending to use, and what is the literature backing said practices. How are existing plans structured, and are there any gaps and where? So from that, I started to dive a little bit deeper into the papers that I'd found and taking out any that didn't actually end up applying. And currently, I'm working on consolidating my findings. So to take it back one step, the primary resources that I've been using are COPS, existing federal guidelines, and honestly the relevant literature from the SEER Educational Research Brief on benthic disturbance, gosh, that's a mouthful, has been a great source of current methods. So for the overall structure, I plan on separating into three major components as listed here: hard bottom, soft bottom, and cable installations. These will then be fleshed out more so into the subsections that's outlined already within ROSA's Fisheries guidelines chapter. So that's objectives and testable hypotheses, spatial scope and temporal scope, sampling design, sampling methods, data collection, and analytical methods. So this next slide, so this is not really what the final product is going to look like. This is more so a visual of how I am organizing the information that I'm finding. So you can see this is for the cables section, and it has the other subsections on there. And as I go through each paper, I extract out the information that I need that would fit into these subsections and kind of just consolidate them and group them together. So in order to kind of not make it be very repetitive and consolidate it better so it's a bit cleaner, you'll notice that there are superscripts right next to each of the sections or statements, and each superscript is referencing a particular paper, COP, or whatever document I'm using. And so if there's any information that is shared between them or repeats, I'll just add a superscript to it to denote that. And that way it gives me a quick glance into what kind of methods and practices are being most commonly used and being recommended. So next, once I finish this portion, I'm intending to kind of take all of this to then create the a draft of the benthic habitat monitoring guideline chapter and an associated annotated bibliography. Thank you for your time.
Awesome. And I just want to say, Dave highlighted something that we've all, I think, been talking about in terms of making sure we have folks that are coming into the pipeline. And so just really proud of Nusrat and Delaney's work this summer. We gave them a pretty broad set of tasks to handle, and they're just doing a fantastic job. So if you have a chance, please come find Nusrat and Delaney during the conference. We would love for them to connect with all of you and learn how great it is to work with all of us. And so, Delaney, if you want to come on up. And your slides are not in here. That's amazing. Okay.
My notes.
So, a note for everyone. If you change the thing that's in Google, it does not update here. Good to know, because I thought we were just cool. Okay, great. Thinking on our feet. We have time. Sure. Sure. I don't know how to turn off the screen. Okay, well. Yes. Where's our super AV person that dives in and fixes everything? Please hold. Okay. Anyway. Not there. Okay. Amazing. I'm not sure what I'm going to do, but just for the sake of time, why don't we...
That was kind of boring, but...
if you feel comfortable, and you would be willing to, if you want to just go ahead and speak.
Yeah.
Okay. You can pull it up on a phone.
Hi, everybody. I'm Delaney. I'm going to go ahead and borrow one of Nusrat's slides just so you can see the chapter titles. But hi, I'm Delaney. I am a graduate student at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I'm doing the socioeconomic chapter outline this summer. So there are socioeconomic, social, and economic. Going into this, I sussed out two large sections of issues within fisheries and offshore wind development. So with social, there's perceptions and attitudes. And then within economic, everything ranges from sharing space, differences in income and costs associated with offshore development in fisheries. And so with those kind of two broad ideas going into mind, I pulled from three broad buckets of information to first look into my literature. So existing COPs, specifically CVOW and South Fork, which specifically talked about socioeconomic monitoring in their COPs, and of course looked to others as well to identify some gaps. I also looked into different relevant published literature, specifically. Oh, thank you. Sure. Thanks, guys. Specifically fisheries case studies, as well as marine protected area case studies for their methods, as well as NIMS and BOEM's published guidelines. And so looking at this slide with the different chapter headings, I'm using the same chapter subheadings and the socioeconomic chapter. And so I'll just very briefly go over some of the details we're going into each of those chapters or subchapters. So under objectives and testable hypotheses, I'll be talking about establishing baseline conditions, going over some suggestions from NOAA for guidelines on commercial fisheries data. Under spatial scope and temporal scope, I'll be focusing on regional sampling that is targeted to project-specific impacted communities, not just broad regional areas. In sampling design, I'll be going over guidance for empirical studies, interviews, and surveys. Under sampling method, I'll be talking about including examples of survey components for those surveys and interviews. And then in data collection, I'll be addressing specific data collections that should be considered within all these different surveys. And under analytical methods, I'll be providing examples of relevant analyses, including like consumption and income and social economic impact analyses. And then finally, I'll be exploring differences in monitoring guidelines for recreational and commercial fisheries because there's such a different approach to both of those sections. And I'm also going to be receiving feedback from subject matter experts And then as the chapter develops this fall, we'll be speaking with our advisory council as well as other researchers. And so looking forward to developing this chapter. My email is not on the board, but come find me and happy to hear any feedback or answer any questions you might have. Thank you for your time.
I will go ahead and take full responsibility for that mess up, and thank you for thinking on the fly. I think one of the great things about this community is that you all are very welcoming and willing to be gracious, so thank you for that. And so, we do have just a few minutes at the end here to kind of wrap it all up with a bow and tell you all kind of what we're hoping for as an organization. But I just want to remind you all that as an organization, we're really just a reflection of you all, the community, right? So the foundation of ROSA and RWSC is to create this collaboration that we all keep agreeing is so important. And so in particular, ROSA has this unique background and history of the fishing industry and the offshore wind development industry coming together to put the science first. That was the foundation of our organization, and we're really proud of the fact that we advocate for involvement of the fishing industry, not just on the collaborative research side in terms of getting the work done, but all the way from the inception. And so what Tricia shared about our launch for Fish Forward, it's not only exciting because it's a tool for everyone to use, but it's also an opportunity for us to get that feedback at the very early stages of topic area selection. So as we move towards these more regional approaches to monitoring, we need to inform that with not only what we think as scientists is important, but also for the communities that are potentially being, impacted by development in terms of the fishing industry itself. So it's great that we have these tools, and it's great that we have this push towards science-backed decision-making, but we want to always ensure that we're involving the fishing industry as much as we can in the development of the science so that we are answering questions that are pertinent not only for regulators but for the community as well. So just to say that obviously as a group, great levels of coordination are needed to even get at these more large-scale cumulative type of assessments, obviously. But just a reminder that, our organization is a reflection of what we are told is needed. And so those three key objectives are the outcomes of lots of discussion with our stakeholders and with our research advisors and advisory council members to kind of emphasize, we need collaborative research and data-driven decision-making, but the reason we need it is that these long-term outcomes that we're hoping for are only achievable if we approach it that way. So I know, this was a little bit of a switch in the format for our session today, but I just really want to thank, again, the panel members for their amazing insights. So thank you all. And since we have just a minute or two, I will take a question from the audience. If someone wants to ask the panel member, you can just raise your hand and shout out. We're in a small room. Brendan.
Hey folks, thank you, Brendan Grundy with the Nature Conservancy. This is for anybody. I think I have this right that the requirement for fisheries monitoring plans only begins 2 years before construction, and I'm wondering if the folks at the panel think that that's the right timeline. Sorry, Brian.
Well, I won't answer whether it's right or wrong, but the requirement is that you have to have information on to characterize the fisheries at the time of the COP submission. What we see happening, though, the same guidance also says that you should plan your monitoring around also your post-construction monitoring. And so what we see is a lot of developers want to do that as a continuous data collection stream, right? So it takes about 2 years from the time that we say your COP is deemed complete to the COP approval. So there's still a couple years in the COP development that are even preceding that. So there's a lot of that work So they're including available information, characterizing the resource at the COP submission, but they're correct that they're usually not starting those surveys until further into the project review cycle and then carrying them through post-construction. A complicating factor that I think I should point out too is that some of these surveys have the potential to take endangered species. So we don't get the biological opinion that would give the coverage for those surveys until very close to the end of that COP approval. So I just wanted to, those are some of the challenges. I think Deidre mentioned there's a lot of challenges out there, and different protocols. Should we think about non-extractive ways of data collection that could potentially move forward more quickly rather than those that might result in take of endangered species. But it's a challenge that we're all still working on, and one that I'm looking forward to collaborating with on all these different groups to look at. But I don't know if anyone else has any insight or want to add to that.
I think that was a great answer. So thank you for the question, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I think we have, I think we are at time actually. Okay, she said yes. So thank you so much.